Good morning, everybody. It's such a joy to be with you all again. I actually feel good having to put on a nice warm sweater this morning. Ever since Jennifer sent me the article about the earliest Memorial Day, I've been thinking about the importance of stories and how they help us to understand life and understand ourselves. And stories have literally been falling into my lap. Here's one that really touched me. Maximilian Kolb was a Polish Franciscan priest that was known for his leadership in the Catholic Church and his skill as a writer. He also had a passionate devotion to the Virgin Mary. A prisoner at Auschwitz concentration camp, he chose to save the life of another inmate by offering his own. A physician prisoner who was a witness to this selfless exchange recorded the story this way. It happened that at the end of July or the beginning of August, a prisoner escaped from the garden detail, I believe. This escapee not having been found, the camp authorities decided to choose 10 prisoners from the barracks for punishment. During roll call, I was separated from Kolb by 3 or 4 persons. The commander chose 10 prisoners, among them Francis Gajanowicz. And when this man learned what was to happen to him, he began to cry with pain and despair that he had a wife and children. He wanted to see them again, and he was going to die. At that point, Father Maximilian Kolb stepped out of line. He lifted his cap and declared to the commander, pointing to Gajanowicz, that he wanted to be taken in place of the other prisoner, as he had no wife and children. The commander asked him his profession, and he replied, "I'm a Catholic priest." There followed a moment while the SS officer showed a certain surprise, and then the commander ordered Gajanowicz to get back in line and Kolb to take his place among those who were condemned to the bunker and to certain death. Richard Rohr writes this, quote, "Growing up in Poland, I was shaped by many stories of World War II that I heard over and over again as a kid. I believe these stories of Kolb and of others offer us a way out of the logic that our world operates on, a logic that lives inside us and governs so many of our basic drives, a logic that led to the war that these stories described. And also, in some ways, this logic is responsible for many of the heartbreaking things we are witnessing today, personal things and societal things," close quote. So just a few minutes ago, we heard Jennifer read a story of a very early memorial service and observance. It was a story of recently emancipated slaves exhuming a mass grave where some 260 Union soldiers had been hastily buried by their Confederate counterparts. This was a story that had been buried, suppressed, until it was recently discovered serendipitously by David Blight while doing research for a book on the Civil War. Emancipated slaves, people who had been deprived of freedom, of family, of well-being, who had been dehumanized by slavery. These people doing the terrible work of exhuming a mass grave, reburying and memorializing those 260 some soldiers, is a story that, as Richard Rohr writes, offers us a way out of the logic that this world so often operates on, a logic that lives inside us and governs so many of our basic drives. White supremacy has moved to center stage in our national life. At rock bottom, it was white supremacy that nurtured and protected the building of an economy and a way of life that tortured and dehumanized Black and brown bodies right from the very founding of this country. White supremacy's story feeds on a certain logic. Black and brown bodies are strong. They don't feel pain the way white folks do. Black and brown bodies do not feel human emotion the way white bodies do. They can withstand having their children stolen from them, tolerate their wives and husbands being sold away, never to be seen again. Black and brown bodies are not as human as white bodies are. This is a logic that lives inside the body of this country. It is a logic that is live and well. And then a long hidden story comes to the surface. A group of formerly brutalized, dehumanized slaves, recently liberated from bondage, does the most exquisitely human and humane thing. They seek to honor the dead, predominantly white bodies, with a decent burial, and then to create a memorial ritual to mark the memory. Metaphorically, they dig up the past. By their very humanity, they change the white supremacist narrative about themselves and challenge the rest of humankind to see and understand a different story. It's no wonder that the story was suppressed, that the citizens of Charleston were completely unaware of the event. As Blight writes, this was a story that had really been suppressed both in local memory and certainly in the national memory. But no one who witnessed it could ever have forgotten it. The story challenges the logic that feeds white supremacy. It's a dangerous story. But it does open a way out of that pernicious logic, a way into remembering and celebrating our common humanity. Witnessing the event is a critical component in healing. Humanizing stories from the Holocaust, from the excruciating pain of the Civil War, from the depths of a pandemic. Humanizing stories remind us that we shape reality and that we are shaped by the stories that we hear and tell. Witnessing the grief that was revealed in our opening prelude this morning is an act of acknowledging the reality of the trauma that war inflicts on human beings of every class and age. Bearing witness is an act that makes real an event that has happened. Witnessing shapes our collective consciousness, creating a space for potential change in the way we make meaning of an event. On a day that's dedicated to remembering, to recalling the pain and the loss that surrounds us and is continually unfolding around us, helps us to address and to mitigate the suffering, and perhaps to take action, to set action in motion so that a particular suffering might not be repeated. So on a national holiday set aside for remembering, it's a good thing to think about our stories and the role that they play in our lives. If memory serves me correctly, I think it was Mary Daly, an early feminist theologian, who hyphenated the word remember so that it becomes a word that invites us to, in a sense, revisit, rejoin, and reconnect our memories into a narrative that reminds us of who we are. And we all have stories that have shaped our understanding of who we are. Some of them are happy, they are validating stories. Some of our stories perpetuate old wounds. Some are stories that need to be revisited and perhaps edited and rearranged, reinterpreted, possibly even discarded, so that the information and the meaning that they carry is life-affirming and nourishing rather than life-negating and diminishing. I've been thinking a little bit in terms of macro stories, mega stories, and micro stories. Macro stories might be those that undergird a certain perspective on life that is based in ancient wisdom. A macro story, excuse me, might not necessarily be factually true, might not even be historically true, but it may carry life-shaping wisdom. Some of the stories in the early chapter of Genesis in the Hebrew scriptures are an example of macro stories. In the creation myth, right at the beginning of Genesis, there is the notion of B'Tselem Elohim, the affirmation that all human beings are created in the divine image and likeness. Not just some, but all human beings carry a holy life spark within them. A macro story like this has the power to shape how we view and understand and respect one another as manifestations of holiness. Imagine, if you will, a world where that story is so well internalized in our collective consciousness, and human beings universally see and relate to one another as embodied sparks of divine holiness. A little later in the Genesis narrative, there's a story of the patriarch Abraham sitting in the shade of his tent during the hottest part of the day, recovering from a self-inflicted, covenantal, painful ritual of circumcision. When three strangers approach, he rises and runs to greet them, ordering that water be brought for their dusty feet and that a feast be prepared for them. This is a macro story of extravagant hospitality that might even be the template for the extravagant hospitality that a small Unitarian congregation on Martha's Vineyard offers to all who make their way to the entrance of the church building. The story of the Buddha sitting quietly in meditation under the Bodhi tree, having rejected a life of wealth and privilege and well-being in favor of a life of ego relinquishment and wisdom. That's a macro story that inspires and shapes the values of millions of people who then become a force for positive change in the world. Macro stories carry universal wisdom and truth that have the power to influence our lives in untold ways. Then there are the mega stories, like the ones we have heard about emancipated slaves, creating a memorial for soldiers who perished in an inhumane setting. Or a story of a priest who steps forward to offer his life in the place of a condemned prisoner. These are stories that reshape our inner logic about how things are, stories that challenge us to see things with a broader lens. And finally, but no less important, are the micro stories. These are the little stories that make up the fabric of our own lives, the stories that we carry with us for good or for ill, stories that shape how we see ourselves, how we fit into the larger picture. As with any story, sometimes these personal stories are generous and expansive, and they imbue us with a sense of well-being and wholeness and value. But sometimes old stories have to be uncovered and revisited and reshaped and remembered if those stories keep us from living whole, generous, and joy-filled lives. And I wanted to tell you a little bit of my story to illustrate the micro stories. I'm the oldest of 5 children. When I was 22 months old, my younger sister was born, and in some peculiar way, as children are wont to do, I drew the conclusion that I was not everything my parents wanted, so they got another one. When I was 9 years old, my next sister was born, and I felt wedged out a little further from the orb of my parents' attention. Extraneous, not so important in the family. When I was 14, my mom delivered a set of strapping twin boys. And the joke that was floating in the ethers was that my parents had kept trying until they got a boy. My personal myth was that I was not good enough, that I was extraneous, and that I should have been a boy so that my parents would love me. When I was in my mid-60s, two friends gave me the gift of having my astrological chart done. And for this to happen, I needed to have the date and the hour of my birth. Well, the date was obvious, but I had no idea what time of day I was born. My mom had passed some 15 years earlier, so I couldn't verify it with her. And I was sure that my dad would have had no recollection of the hour, since it was my mom who always remembered my birthday for both of them. But I really wanted to have my chart done. So I asked my dad if he had any recollection of my time of birth. And he told me my birth story. Remember, I was in my 60s when this happened. And it was a story I'd never heard. He recalled that he had taken my mom to the hospital around 10 p.m. on the night of May 16th, 1942. Labor was progressing slowly, and the nurses sent him home around midnight. He had barely gotten through the door at home when the phone rang, and the nurses said he'd better come back because my mom was about to deliver. So my dad was able to pin my birth time down to within a half hour in the sweet wee small hours of May 17th, as he recalled. But the bonus of the story was that he and my mom were so thrilled that I was a girl because that was all they had wanted. They hadn't even picked out any boys' names. They had not been trying for a boy. They wanted a girl. Hearing my dad's story of the anticipation of my birth was the most powerful antidote to my feelings of being less than, not good enough, that had hovered in my own personal myth for most of my life. This is the power of story to change assumptions and to create a new way of seeing things, to offer us a way out of the logic by which the world operates. We may have stories that set the direction of our lives, and these stories may need to be re-examined, especially if they are limiting or life negating. We may carry memories of stories and wonder what their meaning is. Whether they are historical narratives about our collective lives as human beings, ancient myths that have been passed down, or personal narratives that we've not examined, our lives are made up of so many stories. The stories we heard at the beginning of the service challenge us to listen more closely to the stories around us, especially the stories that offer us a way out of the logic by which the world operates. Memorial Day is an invitation to remember, to recollect, to reconstruct. And doing this invites us to be more careful and thorough witnesses of life, to the lives of others, to our own lives, to the rapidly unfolding events around us. Human beings are storytellers, and human beings love to hear stories. A good story can create a new way of seeing life. It can broaden our understanding. It can challenge our existing logic and change us for the better. Witnessing and storytelling go hand in hand. Perhaps today you will tell or hear a story that will open you to new levels of awareness and understanding. So may the stories that we hear and that we tell become gifts that we give to one another in the service of the wholeness and well-being of us all. Let it be so. Amen.